Nicole, for that nice introduction and for inviting me here today. I want to acknowledge my co-investigators on the project, John Gritch and Victoria Banyard, that I'm going to be talking about most today, but I also, especially because they're here with me, want to acknowledge my research assistants who have done a lot of what I'm going to be talking, a lot of the analyses I'm going to be talking about today, and really helped make out the resilience portfolio. So you all are going to get to find out what your own resilience portfolio is at the end of the day today, and they are really the ones who helped make that happen. So that is Elizabeth Taylor. Yeah, that's right. Yes, yay. Matt Hagler and Wojciech Kajkowski. my better three quarters. So I was really delighted to be invited to this series today because I think it is terrific that we are focusing on wellness and that we have shifted here on campus towards talking about our wellness center and our wellness colloquia, which is this series is part of. And that really reflects the direction that my work has turned in toward too. And also, I think more and more that there's more momentum for building the field up about that. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that before we start getting into the nitty-gritty details, that for a long time, that especially in psychology or in social work or medicine or any of the helping professions, that you basically either met clinical criteria for a disorder, you were depressed, or you were schizophrenic, or you were bipolar, or whatever, or else you were fine. And those were like the only two sort of choices. And that fine was just this kind of big amorphous blob on the not meeting clinical criteria for a disorder. And I think we have finally started to talk about, in a more informed kind of way, that there's more to the fine part of the spectrum than just not having a disorder, and that there's really a range there in terms of thinking about thriving after adversity or after other types of things. And that's really what I want to try to get us to focus on today. And I didn't bring in, I'm mostly a violence researcher, and I've been doing that for more than 20 years now. I'm also a clinical psychologist by training, spent a lot of time working with battered women in shelters and in emergency rooms and settings like that. I've worked with a lot of victims of childhood sexual abuse, both as adults and as children. Do a lot of research, as Nicole mentioned, on all different types of youth victimization now. And one of the things that I've really come to feel is wrong about the way that we think about that and approach that is that we tend to talk about it as if, oh, here are these poor victims over here and these evil perpetrators over there, and then here are us, the knights in shining armor, the psychologists and the social workers and the physicians who come off and help them and save them. And it's this very us-them sort of thing. There's this implicit kind of understanding with the expert role that I'm not a victim, I'm not a perpetrator, my life is perfect, and the way that I'm going to help you is to try to get you to have something that's more like my perfect life. And in fact, although I didn't bring it today because I'm trying to shift off of horror stories because I know a lot of horror stories from having been out in the field for so long, but the fact of the matter is that there are very few people out there in the world who are really zeros when it comes to adversity. And especially those of us who have survived to adulthood, it's highly unlikely that there's a single solitary person in this room who has not been touched in some way by some type of adversity. It could be sibling violence. If you have brothers and sisters, that would be one. I have two sisters that are very close in age to me, and so that would be one that I've been touched by. It could be bullying. It could be, we used to think that direct experience of violence was worse than witnessing or exposure. But we know from a lot of the work we've been doing in recent years on children's exposure to their parents' domestic violence, children's exposure to violence in their community or in their schools, that there's really, you can't tell the difference in terms of the psychological outcomes between witnessing domestic violence between your parents and being a victim of child abuse yourself. In fact, in some of the research that we've done with the National Survey of Children's Exposure to Violence that Nicole mentioned earlier, it actually turns out that the kids' exposure to their loved ones getting harmed has more psychological impact on them than even their own direct experience of abuse or victimization. And some of the other things that we used to think are not held up by the research either. So for example, we used to have this idea like boys will be boys, or that's just, playground stuff, kids will be kids. And now we know that you can't really tell the difference in terms of the psychological consequences and the social and developmental consequences on bullying and peer victimization as with a lot of adult perpetrated harms too. As Nicole has mentioned, I've been in the field a long time. I go to a lot of these meetings, and it's very common that somebody will come up, and maybe their specialty is exposure to domestic violence, or their specialty is child sexual abuse, and they'll come up and they'll say, child sexual abuse is the most toxic thing that could possibly happen to a child. And then you'll sit there and you'll listen to their talk, and then you'll go to the next symposium, and the exposure to domestic violence expert will get up and they'll go, exposure to domestic violence is the most toxic thing that can happen to a child. And the reason that they're doing that is that they're not intentionally lying, but they're wrong. And the reason that they're wrong is because historically we have just studied these things all one at a time. And that is not really the way that these things happen in the world, and it's not the way that we all get to adulthood. And it turns out that it doesn't really matter what type of thing happens to you. It's more matters how many bad things happen to you and over what period of time. And so it's more the total burden of what your burden of victimization, and not just victimization. As I work in this field more and more, I find myself also paying more attention to other types of loss too, which typically have also been studied in isolation. So things like death of a parent, severe illness of a parent, homelessness, all of these things, any one or two of them, there's probably not a person in this room that hasn't had at least one or two of these experiences or seen a loved one have one or two of these experiences. The difference between us really tends to be whether we're still kind of in the low single digits or whether we're getting up into the double digits in terms of our total burden of these types of adversities. So what does that have to do with resilience? Well, it really has a lot to do with resilience and with wellness. And so you'll see I could have brought you so many slides and statistics on all that stuff. And I'm trying, like I said, I'm trying to get more positive and strengths focused. And so what it has to do with resilience is that one of the important insights that it offers is that there's a lot of us who really manage to thrive and do quite well despite the fact that we can have, in some cases, pretty substantial burdens of adversity and bad things happening to us. And in fact, there's this concept called post-traumatic growth that might suggest that there might even be ways in which if you've managed to cope with the adversity, that it does leave you stronger in certain ways than you were beforehand, so that even something that might be mostly a bad experience, that there can still be a silver lining to it. And so the key is figuring out how do you get to that place of resilience and thriving, even though it's not that likely that you're going to be a zero when it comes to the burden of victimization or adversity. And so a lot of our prevention programs, for example, they're kind of predicated on the idea, for example, even with something like it's in the news all much today, like campus sexual assault, we kind of come in and we kind of act like we're talking to a room full of freshmen who have never experienced a victimization. Well, that's not true. Almost every freshman in freshman orientation is already going to have a victimization experience under your belt. And so the point is not how to stop from ever becoming a victim. Even if you have a room full of kindergartners, our data show that you're too late for that. A room full of kindergartners is not a room full of non-victims. You can't get a room full of non-victims. And so what you need to do is to be able to talk to people about, okay, bad things are going to happen to you. I don't know what they are, I don't know how many there are going to be, but that doesn't mean that you can't still thrive and that you can't still be successful. And in fact, that's what happens to most people. Most people who have really bad things happen to them still manage to thrive and still be successful. George Bonanno has a great phrase for it. He calls it the ordinary magic of resilience. So the ordinary magic of resilience is that all of us do, for the most part, manage to cope with this and figure it out. And so what we're trying to do with our new project, and this is what I want to turn to now, is try to figure out how we can get better at that and how we can help the people who have maybe a little bit higher score on their total victimization burden, how we can help them get to this place of resilience and thriving. So what we've been doing is focusing on strengths. And what we did is we turned to the positive psychology literature. And for those of you who are psych majors, actually there's going to be a new course taught in our department on it next year. But what you may or may not know, depending on how much time you spend in psychology, is that positive psychology actually has kind of a mixed reputation in the field of psychology. A lot of people think it's really hokey, that it's, I've heard people say things like, oh, it's just taking all of the adjectives out of the dictionary and turning them into psychological constructs, that it's that it's too pat and easy. And there is a certain amount of truth to those critiques that you hear about positive psychology. In its worst form, it can be kind of hokey, and it can seem sort of random in terms of like what it's deciding to study on. But what we felt about that, though, is that it still had something that was missing from the field of resilience and from the more applied clinical fields, and that a lot of the risk factors that people have studied for over the years, when they say they're trying to get more strengths focused and they say they're trying to get more positive, they're not really bringing in new information. So for example, we'll study things like a bad relationship with your mother, and so even back to Freud, right? We've been studying that one for a really long time. And we'll say a bad relationship with your mother, that leads to bad outcomes. And then they'll come in and they'll say, well, now we're going to be all, thriving and resilience and protective factor focused. And so then they're going to say, okay, from now on, we're going to study good relationships with your mother. And, which is good, in a glass half full kind of way, but it's not good in the sense that that doesn't add any information to what we already knew. It's like, so if you already knew that if a bad relationship with your mother was good, then you already have the piece of information that a good relationship with your mother is better, right? It doesn't add anything. And so what positive psychology can do is it can bring in some new ideas to the stuff that we've been talking about and studying for a long time. And those are the ones that I want to show you where we've gone with some of that today. And so right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out my crystal ball and I'm going to predict the future of all of you all in the room with my data, with science, not with actual magic. And I'm going to focus on some of the strengths that we think are most helpful towards becoming resilient and being the kind of person that always gets back up after they get knocked down. And then at the end of the time, we're going to actually let you all take a little questionnaire and plot your own resilience portfolios. So here, we've collected this really large sample right here in this area, in this part of Tennessee, and a little bit in Alabama and Georgia. It's 2,500 people, and I think these data are just fun to look at. Actually, I think these data are fun to look at because you're going to see on a bunch of them, the good news for you all is that it turns out on a lot of these data that 16 is pretty much the nadir of existence, and they're at the bottom. So down here is bad, and up there is good. And so you guys, so some of these, you guys are really turning the corner. So the good news is, you're 20, 21, you're getting into the positive side, and you're getting ready to look like all of the older people. So here's one that turns out to be really an important one, emotional awareness. So emotional awareness just basically means being able to tell when you're angry, being able to tell when you're sad, being able to identify the difference between those things and other people. I have a story I love to tell about my daughter who's 14 now, and of course she has the very, very sad fate of being raised by 2 clinical psychologists, me and Dr. Barty. I hope you will offer your condolences the next time you see her, and my son. But so she learned from a very young age, about all this like feeling stuff, And so one day when she came up, and she couldn't have been more than like 2 or 3 years old, and she just comes up to me and she's just crying her eyes out, and I'm like, what's the matter? And she's like, I have mixed feelings. And I'm like, yeah, those are a bummer. But if you're emotionally aware, then you know when your feelings are mixed. You can tell that you know a bunch of different types, and you can figure out what they are. It turns out to be a really good thing to have. The other thing that's related but a little different to emotional awareness is emotional regulation. And you all can see, once again, 16, the nadir of existence. My daughter's 14, so these data have me really scared. But you do also see this kind of steady upward trajectory. You guys are not quite there yet. Of course, if you go out to any of the frat parties or whatever on a Saturday or Sunday night, you can kind of see that your emotional regulation is not quite where the 30s and 40-year-olds have it, right? But it's getting there. So this is another one of these things that just takes this lovely upward trajectory over time. Endurance, so this is kind of, sticking with something and finishing it to the end. Again, I'm kind of ignoring the older people in the room. But for those of you who are students, you're like right here where you're just about to get off into this range where you just pretty much see us, the rest of us, holding steady. Honesty and humility. This one just really cracked me up. Again, look at these 16-year-olds. I don't know, what can we say about it? It's interesting. What you can see here is that what the age squared and the age cubed mean, that those are just fancy notes to ourselves that these turns here are statistically significant turns. So it's not just that little kids are also dishonest and you don't really learn to be honest until you get later. It's actually that the preteens, the 12 and 13 and 14 and 15-year-olds, are significantly more honest than the older adolescents, and that they are really bottoming out with the lies, which... I can actually tell you that this is true. So, in taking a step towards, admitting that I'm not perfect, this was true for me. I mean, these were the years when I was lying to my parents the most. Sid's nodding. See, we're going to come out as having been former 16-year-olds. and then up here, we hit this top level, and then we sort of flatten out up there. So those are the regulatory strengths. Those are the ones that basically do tend to come later. There's probably some neuroscience behind this. Many of you might know that your frontal lobes, for those of you who are under 25, are not quite cooked yet. And so that's part of where that developmental trajectory is coming from. The other area that we have really decided to focus on is what we're calling meaning making. It includes religion and it includes spirituality, and it's one of those areas that really has been so neglected in so much of psychology, and especially on the clinical side. I talk a lot about the field of psychology and much of social science and medicine and health too, sort of being siloed. So things get into these little boxes, and so there is a box for the psychology of religion. It's not that nobody studies that anywhere. But the thing is that spirituality and religion are important to lots of things other than just spirituality and religion. And so what's missing is that people don't talk about it in other things. And so, for example, to go back with my work for battered women, most of the work I have done with battered women has been in the Bible Belt, and and around here in this part of the world, that's how people cope with a lot of things. They draw on their personal faith. They reach out to their church minister or their church congregation or whatever, their synagogue or whatever religious institution it is. And they rely on that, but in traditional psychology and in traditional psychotherapy, we often don't ask about this stuff at all. It's like we're afraid to talk about it. And there are good reasons why psychology and most healthcare is pretty secular, because of course you wouldn't want to be afraid to go to the hospital because the people at the hospital practice a different religion than you, right? I mean, we need law enforcement and social services and healthcare to have open doors to everybody for everything. But at the same time, we can't miss out on what makes a difference to everybody else by being, making sure that we're open to everybody. I was giving a talk on this last year in Britain, and some of my colleagues there had just done a survey of the entire country of Wales, and they said it was terrible. It was such a scandal that there were entire cities and villages that didn't have a single service available for victims of crime. And I said, really? I said, there weren't even like churches there? And they're like, oh, well, we didn't count the churches. But churches, in fact, provide a huge number of services to victims of all kind, and I don't have time to go into that in like a huge amount of detail, but we felt this was something that was really missing, so we decided to look into this too, and in fact, this turns out to be the domain that accounts for the biggest chunk of the variance in a lot of our measures of well-being is meaning making. So we didn't want to just measure that in terms of religiosity or religious involvement, although we did look at that. So here's a sense of purpose. Basically the key to meaning making is to find something outside of yourself that you can commit to and that you can feel connected to. It goes up and down a little bit. You guys are kind of peaking. Right now you're probably all like, going to Uganda and stuff like that. And then once you have kids of your own, you that falls off a little bit. And then when you're done and your kids get a little older, then you can kind of get back into that sort of work. That's probably a lot of what's going on there. Optimism just had this like straight upward trajectory. So that's kind of good news. Religious meaning, so this is sort of religious and more explicitly religious or institutional involvement in spirituality. I think what's going on here is that in a lot of religions that kids are pressured to go have their bar mitzvah or to get confirmed in their church, or a lot of different religious institutions have coming of age ceremonies of different types at this age, where there's probably a lot of family pressure to stay involved in it up through that age of 13, 14, 15. And then it dips again down here. The college years are not well known for their church attendance. And then when you have families of your own, that's traditionally when people kind of tend to come back into the fold, as they say in a lot of religions. This is finding meaning through investment in others' development, so getting involved in community organizations, different things like that. That was pretty flat across the lifespan. It was interesting because it contrasted with this of meaning making through kind of self and identity development. So this is stuff like keeping a journal or a diary, pursuing an instrument, trying to learn a new skill. And you can really see this kind of classic identity development period here. And then when we get about 24 or 25, apparently we all decide that that's good enough. And I'm developed, I've got my identity, and we sort of stop doing that kind of stuff. It was interesting to me because you may have noticed already that this is one of the steepest declines to go in that direction, where it's high in the younger years and drops off in the older ones. So one of the other things that we were trying to do, is that again, like thinking about the community that we're in, is that a lot of people here really espouse conservative values. They really, believe in law and order and right and wrong. And so that's another area that psychologists traditionally ignore. So we tried to write some items that would help people, that would help capture those ways of feeling about themselves. So this is that kind of faith in right and wrong and a law and order approach to the world. You can see that kind of goes straight up. Again, you guys are not in your law and order years, most of you. Family care. And then our third domain is interpersonal strengths. What time is it? 5 till what? 1? Okay, great. So community support, thank you. this was one thing that was pretty flat, but it makes sense that it is because you all would be pretty much describing a relatively similar community. You get a little better at romance as we get older, although maybe not as much as you might think, you know. Really, these people over here have 20 years of practice, and they're only like a little bit better than the 20-year-olds, but you know, we can hope to nudge up there a little bit. Maternal attachment, I was surprised at how steeply this fell off across the lifespan. But the interesting thing, one other interesting thing about this is that it falls off much later than paternal attachment, which really falls off in like the early 20s. Social support, this is kind of sad, but it does fit with a lot of data that tends to decline with age. Compassion, on the other hand, goes up, and this was another one that really turned out to be one of the best strengths. So one of the best ways to actually do better yourself and achieve different types of well-being, you know, general interpersonal well-being, spiritual well-being, psychological well-being, is really to have compassion and empathy for others. Generativity is a related concept, so this is kind of starting to invest in the younger generation. So all of you who are teachers, that's a classic generative role. Being a parent is a classic generative role. So again, you know, a little bit less navel-gazing and a little bit more like, what can I do for the, you know, the next group that's coming along. So those were what we were looking at. Those aren't all of them, but we were some 20 some odd different ones. And what we wanted to be able to do is think about how you can build up your resilience portfolio. And so we have done a bunch of analyses, which I'm not going to go over. You just have to take my word for it. And we basically have identified out of all of these ones that we looked at, and some others I didn't show you, the ones that had the strongest association with well-being across several different measures of well-being. And actually, would you mind passing those out? And so these are what we're going to let you find out about today, are the top 3 in each domain. So the top 3 in regulatory were emotional awareness, emotional regulation, and endurance. The top 3 in meaning-making were purpose, optimism, and religious involvement. And the top 3 interpersonal skills were compassion, generativity, and how you describe the support in your community. So as you fill these out, what you will do is that they're going to give you 2 sets of pages. The one is the questionnaire that we used, which is a work in progress, but I think it will give you a pretty good idea. And then you make this little chart, and you can see sort of what your own resilience portfolio looks like. Matt said I could use his so as an example. So this is so Matt's top strengths. Basically, he was really high in all 3 of the regulatory strengths and also in generativity, and he was lower on community support and religious meaning making. So it's not bad. Nobody who's being truthful on these questions is going to come out, and you know, this is just for your own. You don't have to be across the board high on all 9 of these, and it's not very likely that you would be across the board high on all 9 of these. But what is really useful to think about is whether or not you have at least one really strong score in each of these 3 areas. So do you have one regulatory strength that's really pretty good, one meaning-making strength? So if Matt was going to try to work on building up his resiliency portfolio, the place where he probably could focus attention on was on meaning-making, because he had at least one really strong strength in the 2 other areas. So that's basically like how that would work, and it kind of, for those of you who are psychology majors, we've kind of done it in the style of like an MMPI. So I wanted to spend the last few minutes of what I'm going to talk about with just some suggestions for how to build up these strengths from the research literature, and then for the rest of the time I just would open it up for questions or comments, or if you want to interpret your resilience portfolio or whatever. So Sid, earlier this semester, if you don't mind me picking on you again, came and did something on mindfulness meditation, and I think Peggy, Dr. Farmer, also did something on that earlier this semester. So that is actually a fantastic thing to build up your resilience portfolio. And what the research literature suggests on that is that it's really good, and it's great because it's actually good in two different domains. So you can build up your compassion and your empathy through mindfulness meditation, which is an interpersonal skill. And you can also build up your emotional awareness and emotional regulation, which are regulatory skills, through mindfulness meditation. Something that we have been talking about, working on a lot at our program, are narratives. And narratives turn out to be this amazingly effective technique for improving your well-being. I mean, they work so well, you almost don't even believe it. Because what you can do, so like in one of the more famous experiments, is they took a group of people like yourselves, and they just assigned half of you to write about something that is on your mind and is personally meaningful to you. And the other half of you, there was all, in this particular study, it was all freshmen, you guys write about study skills and organization. And then they came back at the end of this semester. So this was just a one-time thing, just like in here, where the whole writing exercise was only like 20 or 30 minutes long. And then what they did is at the end of the school year is they went and got the student health records of all of the students who had written one, and the group, you people who had written on something personally meaningful, actually had gone to the student health center fewer times over the course of the academic year than the kids who were over here and who just wrote about study skills. And you could say that was a fluke, which is definitely what I would have said. Maybe you wouldn't say that, that's what I would say. But they've now replicated this finding dozens of times with lots of different groups. So it works on heart attack patients and cancer patients. It works on new moms. I mean, it doesn't matter who it is. I mean, and so we kind of used to be thinking about maybe journaling or diary writing as something that was sort of this long-term investment and commitment. But it turns out you really don't have to do that, that you can really take in a very short period of time. Sometimes they do 2 or 3 sessions, sometimes they just do one, and and kind of use this opportunity. And what it helps you do is it helps you kind of appraise and organize. And what you're trying to do with these personal narratives, it's also actually probably the biggest thing that's happening in therapy for victimization right now too, is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. It works with victimized kids and adults as well, is that it lets you kind of integrate those bad things that we started off with at the beginning that all of us have had happen to us, and integrate them into your personal story in a way that you can kind of understand them. And then often it helps you move towards that concept I mentioned at the beginning of post-traumatic growth. So trying to understand, okay, this wasn't, not to try to convince yourself that it was actually a good thing that you got bullied for a year on your way to school in the 5th grade. It's not a good thing. We don't want to say it's a good thing. But you can sometimes say, well, what did I learn from that experience? What did I learn about myself? What did I learn about how I want to treat others? And you can try to incorporate that into your understanding of who you are and what your values are, and also try to make it be less central to your identity. One thing that a lot of victims struggle with, especially victims of severe violence, is that it can become the focus of their identity, and that the main thing that they think about themselves as is a rape victim or a bullying victim. Excuse me. I'm getting over pneumonia. Yeah, which takes way longer than you want it to. And so you want to admit that something happened to you. You want to recognize that it was an important part of your life, but you don't really want it to end up being like a central defining feature of who you are. None of us want to be remembered or organize our lives around the worst things that happened to us. And so narratives can kind of help you with that perspective taking too. It turns out I got a colleague of mine really mad at me a few weeks ago because they were talking about their program evaluation, and so many of them, they just compare them to nothing. And I'm like, well, what you really should do is you try running your program and comparing it to a regular exercise program and see if it comes out better than that. Because there's no way it would come out better than that, which is why they got really mad. But regular exercise actually is an amazing sort of thing. And some of the things it helps with is endurance, and I don't mean physical endurance, although obviously it would help with that too, but actually getting into some kind of routine really helps you with learning how to bounce back from other things. And so, dealing with the challenges of your exams and your schedule and all that sort of stuff, learning how to impose a routine on those kind of everyday challenges really is a huge, huge advantage when something really bad happens and your husband gets seriously injured in a car accident and your life gets thrown upside down. If you've been practicing some good routines, then that's the kind of thing that will really help you overcome these other types of events if and when they occur. And it's also one of the great things for optimism too. We were talking about affirmations, which is another thing that you can do. But I know we're standing in the Women's Center, but last year, do you remember those ones that they stuck in all the bathrooms that said, like you were special, and then signed them from the WC, which I don't know if any of you have ever traveled much in Europe, but I thought that was so funny because it was like your toilet was like writing you little affirmations. But so those can help too. If you want to try affirmations, the thing to do is to try to find some that are really meaningful to you, and you can buy those little books, but I don't think that the evidence for just buying those kind of pre-printed ones are necessarily all that great. For the interpersonal stuff, something else, here's another thing that those of us who are in the room who are psychologists or nurses or social workers or faculty members, so much of how many of us reach thriving and resilience is learning to give back to other people. And then when people come to us as clients or students for help, often we don't actually give them opportunities to do the things that really have made life meaningful and wonderful for us. And so getting involved as a volunteer or getting involved with almost any kind of community agency, you might think that you're doing something for other people, but you're probably benefiting yourself at least as much as like anything that you're doing for those other people. And so that's good for the interpersonal ones. Spirituality and religious involvement. It doesn't have to be in an organized religion, but what you need to do here is tap into something bigger than yourself. And I wanted to mention for when I was you all's age, or when me and Sid and Nicole and some of the other people were you all's age, there was a lot of talk about spirituality without religion. That's all that New Age stuff, right? Which was really, really big when I was in college. But now there's this new movement that I think taps into an important piece of what I've been talking about here as far as resilience, and they call it the religion without the spirituality movement. And so it's these people who have kind of gotten involved in churches just so they can go to like the Wednesday suppers and stuff like that. And well, maybe that's an exaggeration, maybe not like just so they can go to like the Wednesday suppers, but people who are kind of more explicitly acknowledging, well, maybe I don't necessarily buy into like every single solitary element of like the creed or the dogma of this particular religion, but that doesn't mean that I don't want to be part of an organized group of people who are like coming together in fellowship. And so now there's this movement that's kind of the opposite of that New Age sort of thing that's called religion without spirituality, where you just sort of go for that. And I do think that is kind of tapping into something essential about what we get from those communities that we get lost with our more increasing secularism. And then the last one that I think can help both with purpose and with endurance is this sort of idea of deliberate practice and goal setting and kind of working on your personal best. If you read that book by, now I'm blanking on the name. What's the guy's name with the big fuzzy hair? Wrote The Tipping Point. Malcolm Gladwell, right. And what was the name of his other book? Outliers. Outliers, right. And so in that book, he says that all you have to do is like practice for 10,000 hours, and then you can be a genius like the Beatles or whatever. But that's actually baloney. I mean, if it were, would that were true, right? You know, because it doesn't account at all for all of the people like the music teachers of the world and what have you, who have easily logged 10,000 hours worth of time or practice in their skill. You guys all know all the crummy senior faculty that are here or at any other institution. Well, it's just true, right? There's a lot of highly experienced people that really stink at what they do. And so the point is not, so you have to weed out the drudges. You can't just say that you can just be, this is that to get good. And the way you get good at things is not just to practice or to log hours in with something, but to really do deliberate practice that has very specific goals. And so, certainly in terms of like students, I think the trap that many students get into is that they just kind of start, phoning it in and punching the clock with your classes. It's really easy to do that. I mean, if you're even modestly accomplished as a student, you will probably still advance towards your degree if you do that. But that doesn't necessarily help you become the person that you want to become. And you really have to put a little bit more oomph and effort into it if you want to do that. And really, I don't know if it's just been kind of this run or what, but in the last couple of years, I've known several Sewanee graduates who, you see them on LinkedIn or on Facebook or whatever, and they're like getting these jobs as like hostesses and stuff like that. And I think that what is which is, to me, is there's nothing wrong with being a hostess, but still, I don't think that's the kind of thing that people like say, well, when I grow up, I want to, be the greeter at Walmart or whatever, And so if when you grow up, that's not what you want to be, then this is what you have to do, is that you really have to get a little bit more goal-oriented and a little bit more deliberate towards the skills that you're trying to acquire as an undergraduate or in anywhere else. And then just to close, I think I've said some of these things. So really just a few final tips to get out of yourself and that when we think about therapy or whatever, that we often think about focusing inward. But the newest data suggests that that's the wrong way to go. If you really want to feel better, focus outward. Go take care, get a dog, get a, maybe not a kid depending on how you're doing, but, but find something else to focus on. Go volunteer. Don't worry about having adversities because we all do, and don't think that the way to happiness is to avoid them because there ain't no avoiding them. And then one thing that I've learned from this study, not so much from these data, but I wanted to mention this is from the interviews that we've done, is that it really, and you can kind of see this from the age stuff, is that if you think of these three domains as like three legs of the stool, the regulatory one seems to be the one that trips people up a lot. Not Matt, that was your best one. And so many of the interviews are like, well, I used to really drink a lot, or I used to really run around with these people who would do this, that, or the other, and all this sort of bad, generic bad stuff. And over and over again, it turned out that some kind of interpersonal or meaning-making experience is what finally gave them the motivation to kind of, put that extra little oomph in there and get the regulatory piece in place too. So the one I heard about the most was probably having a kid, but it wasn't always having a kid. I mean, sometimes it was getting a job that mattered to you and you realized you want to get fired from this one. Sometimes it was finding a church that with a community that you really cared about. And there were lots of different ways, but keep that in mind, especially for those of you who are in the developmental stage where the regulatory stuff may not be what's coming the most easily to you, is to think about maybe figuring out a way how you could focus on the interpersonal and the meaning making, and then maybe the regulatory will follow. So I will leave it there, and if anybody has any questions or anybody wants to talk about their portfolios, I'd be happy to throw it open for discussion or comment. I could apologize to Sid for picking on her.
She's resilient.
Yeah, that's right. Well, go check out our website, lifepathresearch.org. If you want to find out if you want to take the questions for all the rest of the strengths, they're on there, and you can go and find out your scores on the other stuff as well.
Thank you, Sherry.
Yep, thank you.